Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a velvet-draped cabinet in a dim Victorian boudoir. You're barefoot on creaky floorboards. There's a faint whiff of lavender sachet and old hair oil in the air. A clock ticks somewhere behind a curtain, and on a marble-topped vanity sits, yes, a glass jar, clear and delicate. Inside it, a neat little coil of chestnut-colored hair, not a wig, not a braid, just a looped lock. Human, preserved, decorated with a silk ribbon like a gift you maybe shouldn't open. And that's where you pause, because the room's full of them, jars on shelves, in corners, beside perfume bottles, all filled with real hair from real people who are very much not here anymore. You probably won't survive this century with your minimalist IKEA sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from your own creaky house, full of family relics and floral wallpaper, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the 1860s now, a time when everything in a woman's life had layers, petticoats, corsets, expectations, and yes, sentimental keepsakes. Victorian homes were shrines to memory. Portraits hung in clusters like mournful family trees. Clocks chimed the hour with grim punctuality. And nestled among all this formality were the strangest little treasures, delicate glass vessels displaying the hair of loved ones, sometimes woven, sometimes curled, sometimes just looped and tied with black ribbon. They weren't hidden. These jars were proudly displayed in parlors and bedrooms. If someone passed away, you didn't just mourn, you memorialized. Hair, unlike flesh or memory, didn't decay. It stayed, like a relic. Historians still argue whether these displays were a genuine cultural comfort or just the Victorian obsession with death dressed up in satin. But for the women who kept them, they meant something. Each strand told a story of someone gone or someone cherished, sometimes both. And in a society where women weren't allowed to voice much, hair offered a secret physical language. That lock in the jar might have come from a fiancé killed in Crimea, or a child lost to scarlet fever, or a friend whose letter stopped arriving one cold spring. And, let's be honest, there's something both oddly touching and wildly unsettling about it. Imagine your mom keeping your baby hair. Now imagine her keeping all of it, neatly labeled, in crystal. Don't worry, we're not judging, just observing. This wasn't just a sentimental quirk. It was a full-blown subculture. Victorian women weren't idly snipping curls and tossing them into jars like spare buttons. There was etiquette, design, even artistry. Some hair was clipped in grief, others as romantic gestures. There were even professional artists, yes, hair artists, who would turn your loved one's strands into braided brooches or miniature wall wreaths. The hair jar was just the start. And sometimes these collections weren't even private. You might visit a neighbor and see a labeled display, George, 1847, beside Mother, 1852. You'd sip your tea while admiring someone's personal museum of loss and affection, not unlike how we scroll memorial posts on Facebook now, except less digital and more follicular. Let's take a closer look. The typical jar was usually cut crystal or delicate blown glass, often hand-labeled with date and name. The hair inside, arranged like a botanical specimen, sometimes woven into a curl, sometimes braided into impossibly tiny knots. If it was morning hair, it might be tied with black crepe ribbon. If it was romantic, maybe red or ivory. And the jars weren't cheap. They were luxury items, often gifted to women of means. Because here's the thing, Victorian sentimentality wasn't casual. It was a performance. And collecting hair was like archiving your soul. Publicly, one woman might keep her late husband's hair in a little urn-shaped jar on the mantel. Another might collect all her children's baby curls in matching containers with embroidered tags. Some went even further, creating elaborate hair wreaths to hang in parlors. A family tree made entirely of braided, looped, and stitched strands, which, yes, sounds like the premise of a horror movie. But at the time, it was sweet, really. You could think of these jars as emotional time capsules, each one frozen at a particular moment, a first love, a final breath, a sacred goodbye. You didn't just remember someone, you preserved a physical part of them, a part that wouldn't rot or fade, unless, of course, you got a bit too close to the fireplace. Mainstream fact. Hair was commonly used in mourning jewelry and crafts between 1830 and 1900, especially in Britain and America. Queen Victoria made it trendier than lace. Fringe tidbit. Some women boiled hair to soften it before weaving, then stiffened the final product with sugar water. Crunchy, sentimental art. And just to keep it academic, let's note, historians still debate whether these hair jars were more personal shrine or social display. Was it grief or good taste? Either way, you're standing in a room full of hair, under a portrait that never blinks, with a nightstand that rattles when it's windy. The candle flickers, a jar glints. Time to open another one. You lean in toward the next jar. This one's smaller, round-bellied like a perfume bottle with a silver cap. Inside, a lock of soft golden hair spirals like a seashell. There is a note curled beneath it, faded almost to invisibility. You can just make out the words. To Arthur, always, E. You try to imagine who E was, a sweetheart, a wife, a widow. That's the quiet thrill of these hair keepsakes. They tell you just enough to start wondering, but never enough to stop. Victorian love wasn't always loud, but it was wildly sentimental. You didn't post about your relationship. You plucked a curl from your temple and gave it to the person who made your knees weak at the Sunday picnic, and they kept it, usually inside a locket or, yes, a fancy glass jar. In the 1800s, giving a lock of your hair wasn't just flirtation. It was a serious emotional transaction, a promise, sometimes even a stand-in for engagement. Hair could say, "I'm yours," or worse, "I was yours until the fever came." Victorians believed hair held the essence of a person, that it remembered things, and since hair didn't rot like the rest of you, it became a kind of immortal memento. Preserving it was like bottling a moment of connection. Mainstream fact: exchanging locks of hair was standard courtship behavior. Popular novels and etiquette guides mention it often, sometimes with instructions for how to cut the hair romantically without alarming the mother. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine being 17, slipping a pair of shears into your pocket and asking your crush for a tiny clump of their scalp. Now imagine handing them a part of your body wrapped in lace. You can see how things could go wrong, and they did. Historians still argue whether women were truly comfortable with the practice or simply obliged by convention. Was the exchange mutual, or just another ritual expected of polite young ladies, like fainting on command and pretending to enjoy boiled cabbage? Hair wasn't always cut. Sometimes women collected the strands left behind after brushing. That was seen as modest, even modestly seductive. You didn't offer the lock, you simply let it be found, like a breadcrumb of affection on a gentleman's glove or collar. Romantic and a little passive-aggressive. In those early love letters, you'd often find an envelope delicately lined with a wisp of hair, sometimes bound with thread, sometimes pressed like a flower. One poor soul wrote his beloved every week for 3 years and kept a separate envelope for each curl she sent back. She eventually married someone else. The curls stayed in his drawer. And yes, sometimes people lied. You might receive a lock and later discover it came not from the sender, but from their unsuspecting sister. Or worse, the maid. It's the 19th century version of catfishing, but with actual keratin. Then there were breakups. You couldn't just delete a hair keepsake like a text. People destroyed them ceremonially, burning them in fireplaces, burying them with letters, even tossing them into rivers like a DIY heartbreak ritual. One woman wrote of clipping my betrothed's hair from my prayer book and placing it into the fire with the Lord as my witness. Subtle, but not everyone used hair for romance. Friends exchanged locks too, especially if they were parting ways. Boarding schools encouraged it. Sisters did it constantly. And if you had no romantic partner to gift your hair to, you still might save it for your diary, or your descendants, or your personal glass shrine on the mantel. You spot another jar. This one's different. It holds a pale braid small enough to be a child's. No note, but a dried flower's been sealed inside. Not for love. This was for remembrance. Victorian women, especially unmarried ones, often kept locks of a sibling's or friend's hair after their death. In cases of epidemics, sometimes it was the only part of a person the family got back. The rest, wrapped in quarantine protocols, was buried far away. You didn't get closure. You got a curl in a jar. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some women slept with hair from their lost loved ones under their pillows, believing it could offer dreams of reunion. One girl claimed her brother appeared to her and smiled through the fog each time she cradled his hair. Hair meant everything and nothing. It was love and loss, memory and madness, sacred and slightly unhinged. That's what makes it so hypnotic and deeply human. You shift your gaze to another jar, larger, darker, with a locking lid. A heart scratched into the glass. No initials. Who was this for? Maybe no one knows. Maybe it was too private to label. That's the trick with hair. It doesn't speak, but it doesn't forget. You're always left guessing. Was this devotion or despair? Even today, if you stumble on an old locket with hair inside, it sends a chill. You feel the weight of someone's feeling trapped in time, coiled tight as a secret. And here's the reality check. In 100 years, what will they find of you? A broken phone? A saved selfie? Maybe a jar with someone else's DNA, if things come full circle. One last joke before we move on. If you think giving someone a lock of your hair is intense, remember, at least it wasn't your toenails. Victorians had limits, mostly. You step back. You've seen just a few jars, and already you feel like you've wandered through a dozen lives, some joyful, some tragic, all preserved in those weightless little spirals that say, I was here, I mattered, please don't forget me. You won't, not tonight. The next jar you notice has a black ribbon tied in a careful bow around its neck, like someone dressed it for a funeral. Inside, the hair isn't blonde or red or golden brown. It's black, jet black, almost blue under the lamplight. And it's not just a curl. It's been formed into a tiny looped wreath, delicately pressed against the glass like it's still waiting for someone to admire it. That's when it hits you. This one isn't about love. It's about mourning. Victorian society had a full-blown relationship with death, and not a casual one. No, they built industries around it. From funeral photographers to mourning stationery, every class of society knew the rules. And mourning hair was one of the most intimate, visible, and oddly accepted parts of the whole ritual. Mainstream fact: by the 1860s, death wasn't just a personal loss. It was a social event, and mourning customs became so elaborate that magazines published entire etiquette guides on how long to mourn, what to wear, and what kind of hair arrangement was appropriate, depending on whether the deceased was your cousin or your husband. If it was your spouse, you could be in mourning for years, for a child, even longer. Queen Victoria famously mourned Prince Albert for 4 decades, and her endless displays of grief helped mainstream the trend. She wore black every day and kept a lock of Albert's hair in a locket she wore over her heart, always. And where the queen led, everyone else followed. Upper-class women were expected to mourn in style: black silk dresses, black gloves, jet jewelry, and, of course, a small shrine at home that might include one or more jars of the deceased's hair. Hair wreaths became common during this time, not the floral kind you wear at festivals, but circular patterns made entirely from human hair, often glued to velvet or mounted under glass. They hung on walls like somber halos, sometimes with tiny white tags identifying each contributor. One family's wreath might include hair from 4 generations, or more if you were the sentimental type, or just didn't clean out the parlor often. Now comes the fringe detail. Some women took to collecting hair before the person died, just in case. Morbid? Maybe, but practical. You didn't want to be left with nothing, and if someone died suddenly, say from typhoid or a runaway horse, you might snip a few locks at the bedside before the undertaker arrived. Sentimental urgency, you might call it. Historians still argue whether this mourning culture was a healthy way to process grief or an emotional corset that made it impossible to move on. One camp says these rituals offered structure and catharsis. The other points to the fact that Victorians often kept the death room untouched for years. One woman reportedly talked to her dead husband's hair jar every morning for over a decade. But in fairness, you talk to your house plants. So who are we to judge? For Victorian women, especially those stuck in the domestic sphere, mourning became an art form. You couldn't vote, but you could express your grief in exquisite detail. You sewed mourning dresses. You learned to embroider handkerchiefs with black thread. And yes, you learned the quiet, meditative work of hair preservation. Hair work, also called gimp work or sepia art, depending on who you asked, required a delicate hand and an absurd amount of patience. You soaked the hair in water, or sometimes lye. You stretched it across wire frames. You used tools more delicate than what dentists used. And eventually you formed it into flowers, leaves, or wreaths. The final piece might go into a frame, a brooch, or, you guessed it, a fancy glass jar. Here's a real-world case. In 1872, a widow named Abigail Trent kept not only her husband's hair in a jar, but also his dog's. She said it brought her peace to know all parts of him, loyal and loving, were together. You might roll your eyes, but you've definitely cried over a pet's Instagram reel. In some circles, the fancier the mourning jar, the more affection you were assumed to have. Some even accused others of grief performing, displaying massive hair wreaths for acquaintances or distant relatives just to look pious or poetic. It's not unlike today's performative grief online, except with fewer hashtags and more glue. You pick up a jar now, carefully. This one has no label, but the hair inside is gray and brittle. Maybe it belonged to someone old. Maybe it was old, clipped decades earlier and kept through multiple deaths, wars, and renovations. Maybe it outlived the person who saved it. That's the other thing about hair. It doesn't just preserve memory, it outlasts it. Some women kept multiple jars, one for a husband, one for a child, one for a mother, lined up like trophies or prayers, each one a silent companion through years of silence. A bit heavy? Sure, but this was an era where death was expected, not denied. You didn't live in denial of it, you designed around it. You decorated it. You included it in your wardrobe and your furniture and your glass jars. And let's not pretend it's over. You may not have a mourning wreath in your hallway, but you've got a playlist called Sad Songs and a drawer full of movie ticket stubs and text threads you scroll when it's late and you feel nostalgic. Victorians just made theirs more tactile. You close the jar and set it down. There's something strangely comforting about it, isn't there? That someone cared enough to snip, save, and preserve the smallest piece of another person. That even when memories fade, a curl of hair remains, tucked inside a delicate vessel waiting for someone, maybe you, to notice. The next jar isn't like the others. It's not delicate crystal or adorned with satin bows. This one's squat, thick, utilitarian, the kind of glass you might find in an apothecary, not a drawing room. Inside, a tangled, coiled braid, dark auburn, bound at one end with old twine. No tag, no ribbon, no sentimentality. This one looks worked, because tonight you're about to step into the world of hair work, not just mourning or romance, but craftsmanship. That's right, the art of making objects entirely out of human hair. You think you're crafty for learning how to crochet? Try weaving a lifelike flower out of someone's scalp while wearing a corset and crying quietly to handle. Victorian hair work was no fringe hobby. It was an actual discipline with tools, techniques, and entire instruction manuals. Women formed hair into bouquets, crosses, trees, serpents, and tiny initials. They made bracelets and brooches, rings, and framed wreaths. Some even created entire dioramas of biblical scenes, all in meticulously shaped hair. Mainstream fact: by the mid-19th century, hair work was so widespread that companies began selling DIY kits. Yes, Etsy existed, just in the form of mail-order pamphlets like Self-Instructor in the Art of Hair Work, which promised elegant results with simple tools and a lot of free time. The basic technique involved wrapping strands around a thin wire, forming loops and curls, then sewing or gluing the shapes into designs. You could use your own hair or someone else's, living or dead. If the strands were short, you boiled them to soften and stretch them. If they were too long, you trimmed them and saved the trimmings. Because waste not, want not. Historians still debate whether the rise of hair work was about creative expression or just an outlet for grief-stricken boredom. Some say it empowered women trapped in domestic spheres to make something lasting and beautiful. Others say it was a way of giving women something to do while mourning stripped away the rest of their lives. But let's be honest. If you had no access to higher education, couldn't vote, couldn't work outside the home, and were expected to express every feeling through silent acts of devotion, you'd probably start weaving hair wreaths too. Maybe not biblical ones, but still, you pick up the jar again. Now that you know what you're looking at, you realize this braid wasn't for show. It was raw material. Hair collected over time, probably from a single person, saved until there was enough to start the piece. Think of it as emotional yarn. Young women often kept a hair drawer, a section of their vanity where they placed strands pulled from their brushes. Once they had enough, they'd begin. Wreaths required dozens of loops. Jewelry required strong, uniform strands. Some girls started as early as 12. It was like embroidery, but with a head start in DNA. And here's the quirky twist. Some women didn't just make art with hair, they sold it. You could purchase ready-made hair jewelry, often advertised as guaranteed to include your loved one's hair. Whether that was true, well, let's just say not all auburn curls were created equal. Sometimes hair was supplemented. Sometimes it was completely replaced with stock hair. From whom? Let's just say there were a lot of unregulated salons and orphanages in London. But for many women, hair work wasn't about commerce. It was about control. You couldn't control the illness, or the war, or the fever that stole your child in the night. But you could create something from what they left behind. You could turn loss into design. Some of the most stunning examples came not from mourning, but celebration. Brides sometimes made hair pieces from their own locks or those of family members as symbolic tokens of joining. Friends traded hair samples in intricate pins. Entire friendship circles wove one another's strands into joint wreaths, like a sleepover craft night, but with less popcorn and more quiet weeping. You move to another jar. This one's shaped like a teardrop. Inside, a fan of light brown strands has been formed into a flower, a rose, maybe. It's suspended against a dark velvet lining, and the petals are sewn in gentle arcs. You stare a little too long. It's beautiful, hauntingly so. That's the thing about hair work. It blurs the line between the uncanny and the sacred. You're looking at part of a person, but also a design, but also a memory. It's intimate, but displayed. And the Victorians wanted it displayed. Parlors often featured shadow boxes or glass domes with the family's best hair work framed like a shrine. Guests were expected to admire it. Women bragged about their skill. Some even entered local exhibitions. One letter from 1883 describes a contest in Bath. The judges favored Miss Merriweather's mourning brooch for its symmetry and pathos. Imagine winning a ribbon for how well you braided your dead uncle's hair. Even the process of hair work had ritual. Women worked in silence, often alone, often late at night by lamplight. It was meditative, even mournful. You weren't just making a thing, you were processing. We don't have much like that today. Maybe scrapbooking or journaling. But few crafts involve handling the literal DNA of people you loved or lost. And before you roll your eyes at how creepy it all sounds, take a moment. You still keep baby teeth. You still save clippings from your child's first haircut. Some people even keep a lock of hair from a pet. That same human urge to preserve memory and matter, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's just changed packaging. You return the jar to the shelf. You've learned to see more than just the hair. You see the hands that looped it, the grief that shaped it, the love that preserved it. And next time someone says the Victorians were so dramatic, you can just smile and say, at least they knew how to make it art. There's a comb on the vanity now, bone-handled, a little yellowed at the teeth. You pick it up. Between the prongs, faint coppery strands cling like cobwebs, forgotten, fragile, but very much still here. You glance toward a small, squat jar on the corner of the dresser. The lid is off. Inside, strands just like the ones on the comb, coiled into a messy little bundle not yet crafted or shaped, just kept. This is where it starts. Because tonight we're not just talking about hair as mourning or romance or art. We're talking about how it got there, how every Sunday evening tens of thousands of Victorian girls gathered up their hairbrush leavings and stashed them away like treasure. Because in a time before vacuum cleaners and personal expression, collecting your own hair was normal, expected even. It was what you did. Mainstream fact, most Victorian women only washed their hair once every 8 to 12 days, sometimes even less. Shampooing was risky business. The products were harsh, the water often dirty, and the process took hours. So daily brushing wasn't just grooming, it was a ritual. And every stroke of the brush left behind hair that had to go somewhere. You didn't throw it away, you saved it into your hair receiver. What's a hair receiver? Glad you asked. It was usually a small jar or pot made of porcelain, glass, or silver with a hole in the top, just big enough to poke hair through. Every time you brushed, you rolled the fallen strands into a tidy ball and fed it through the opening. It was like a weird little donation box for yourself. Some were plain, others were adorned with floral patterns, monograms, or even cherubs. And they weren't hidden away. They sat right there on the dressing table beside your perfume and powder. You'd think, okay, maybe they're just being tidy. But no, the hair wasn't thrown out after collecting. It was used. Used for what, you ask? All sorts of things. Hair stuffing for pin cushions, padding for homemade rats. No, not the squeaky kind, but the sausage-shaped rolls used to inflate Victorian hairstyles. Imagine fashioning your beehive out of your own discarded hair. Resourceful, gross, gorgeous. Some women saved years' worth of hair from brushing until they had enough for a small wreath or bracelet. And yes, we're still talking about everyday hair, not clipped, not curled, just naturally shed. Your own private recycling system, Victorian edition. Quirky tidbit? It was considered romantic to give someone a keepsake made from the hair you'd collected over time, rather than clipped all at once. It meant patience, intention. You couldn't just take scissors to it. You had to earn it, one brush stroke at a time. Historians still argue whether this ritual was driven by sentiment, economy, or just plain superstition. Some believe that discarding your hair improperly could invite bad luck, or even give witches a way to control you. So the safe route was to keep it close, keep it clean, and keep it yours. You picture the scene. Sunday afternoon, a girl sits at her vanity. Her sister braids her hair. The fireplace crackles softly in the background. She holds out the brush and taps it gently over the jar. Loose strands float down like snow. She gathers them with two fingers, rolls them into a ball, and drops them into the receiver. Clink. The lid goes on. Done for the week. A domestic moment, small, forgettable, but multiply it by every girl in every home, and you've got an entire generation trained to see their own hair as both burden and blessing. Not just something that grew from them, but something that meant something. And the line between casual collecting and sacred keeping, very thin. Some families labeled their hair jars by year. Emma, 1864 to 65. Sarah's wedding year. Martha, before the illness. A simple ball of hair could represent entire seasons of joy or loss. A child's first year, a young woman's final one. It was memory in matter. You glance at a jar on a low shelf. This one's barely full. A few stray wisps, pale and fine, resting against the glass. Maybe someone meant to fill it. Maybe they never got the chance. That's the thing about these jars. They speak in unfinished sentences, a pause where someone once lived. There's something tender in the act of collecting your own cast-offs. It's like watching yourself disappear and deciding that even the vanished parts deserve a home. One Victorian diary from 1875 describes a girl collecting her hair during a long illness. It comes away with no pain, she writes. Mother saves it in the green jar, says it will make a lovely piece someday. She didn't live to see the piece, but the jar, according to records, remained in the family, passed down, preserved. Hair outlives people. It resists rot, defies time. Even centuries later, it can be studied. Scientists today can read hair like a diary. What you ate, what you feared, where you lived, what poisoned you. And that's not metaphor. That's actual forensic science. So when you lift a jar of Victorian hair, you're not just holding a keepsake, you're holding a record, a soft, looping, wordless autobiography. And somehow that makes the simple act of brushing your hair into a weekly ritual feel holy. Maybe that's why so many jars exist today, still dusty, still labeled, tucked into antique shops and attic trunks. They waited patiently, and now someone, maybe you, is ready to listen. You return the bone-handled comb to its place. The hair still clings to it, and the next time you find a brush full of strands, you might pause before dumping them in the trash, because once upon a time every strand meant something, every single one. The next item is a drawer, not a glass jar, not a velvet frame, just a drawer, unlocked, half open, waiting. Inside, a mess of fabric scraps, dried flowers, yellowing envelopes, and there, tucked in a little linen pouch, another bundle of hair, a neat coil tied with blue silk, faintly perfumed, though the scents long faded into the fabric. You found what the Victorians might call a hope chest edition, or more precisely, a hair drawer, because while we've seen how hair marked mourning and how it was turned into art, this next layer is about anticipation, about love and longing and strategy. See, Victorian girls didn't just collect hair as a reflection of the past. Sometimes they saved it for the future. Mainstream fact: hope chests, sometimes called glory boxes, were filled with things a girl might need for married life. Embroidered linens, saved recipes, carefully folded undergarments, and yes, hair. Not always out on display, but often tucked inside a pouch or envelope labeled with care. It wasn't unusual for girls to collect their own hair for years, saving it for a future project, something to present to a husband, something to make into a keepsake once a baby arrived, something to stitch into a cushion or a mourning piece, just in case. The hair was personal, sure, but it was also currency. Quirky tidbit? Some girls in boarding schools formed hair clubs, where they'd promise to include one another's hair in future wedding wreaths, sort of like a sentimental pyramid scheme. One girl wrote in 1868, "Mary gave me her braid, should I wed first. I am to send her mine upon her birthday, or funeral, whichever comes first." Dark, definitely, but also kind of supportive. And hair drawers weren't just about self-love. They held the strands of others too, siblings, parents, even suitors. And sometimes those suitors didn't know they were in the drawer. A single handshake at a garden party might end with a glove containing a few treasured strands. You'd be surprised how many Victorian love stories began with gentle theft. Historians still argue whether the hair drawer was truly sentimental or more of a cultural ritual. Some call it emotional curation. Others suggest it was a kind of social insurance. After all, if a proposal fell through, you still had a drawer full of potential backup materials for someone more appreciative. Recycle the romance. You pick up a little velvet envelope from the drawer. Tucked inside is a card, floral border, loopy handwriting, and another small lock of hair, pale blonde, almost white, probably a child's. Not mourning, though. This feels like something joyful. A christening gift, maybe, or a grandmother saving her grandchild's first curl before it was lost to the family album. Hair wasn't just about death and devotion, it was proof. Proof of presence, of growth, of being part of someone's life, even when everything else was swept away by time or distance. And here's a little known but true practice. During engagements, it was common for the couple to exchange tokens, letters, portraits, and yes, hair. But etiquette dictated that the hair must be given after the proposal, not before. To offer it too early suggested impropriety. Too late, and it looked like reluctance. So the timing of hair giving was delicate. Women might prepare the hair ahead of time, keeping it tucked in the drawer, just in case the question was popped. And if it wasn't, well, the hair stayed put, a quiet relic of what might have been. There's a strange power in that. You may have no ring, no vows, no name change, but a lock of hair remains, tangible, undeniable, as close to immortal as most emotions get. And not every drawer was filled with sweetness. Some hair was kept in anger or shame. There are stories, plenty of them, about girls who kept the locks of men who left them, sometimes out of love, sometimes to remember what they survived. One diary entry from 1871 reads, "I keep the lock to remind myself never to trust a man who smells of tobacco and arrogance again." We stand a historical queen with boundaries. Sometimes the hair in a drawer stayed hidden for decades, found only by accident, long after the original keeper had died. There are accounts of entire families discovering hair packets labeled in initials no one remembered. Was it a childhood friend, a dead sibling, a scandal best left unnamed? You close the drawer gently. It creaks in protest, then slides shut with a soft click. The memory sealed again, but not lost. And now you realize these jars, drawers, pouches, they're not so different from the way we save things now. Photos in an app, voice notes, text threads you can't bring yourself to delete. We're still hoarding traces of the people we love, still hoping the stuff they leave behind will explain something they never got to say. Hair just happened to be the most physical form of that in the 19th century. You glance once more at the blue ribbon-wrapped coil. It's not marked, but it doesn't have to be. It means something to someone. And now, weirdly, it kind of means something to you. The next jar doesn't sit on a vanity or rest in a drawer. It stands tall on a fireplace mantel, polished to a shine, crowned with a gilded lid and protected by a small, faded photo in a frame beside it. A young man in military uniform, staring somewhere past the camera, chin tilted with quiet dignity. You know the face. Everyone in Victorian Britain did. Prince Albert. because when we talk about Victorian hair collecting, we eventually land at the feet of the most influential widow in modern Western history, Queen Victoria herself. And if you think your grandma went hard on memorial photos, Victoria made mourning an aesthetic movement. Mainstream fact: when Prince Albert died of typhoid fever in 1861, Queen Victoria plunged herself, and by extension, an entire empire, into decades of structured grief. She wore black for the rest of her life, refused to be seen in public for years, had his clothes laid out daily as if he might still dress and join her, and, most enduringly, she kept his hair, tucked into lockets, framed on the wall, pressed under glass, embedded in jewelry, even sewn into her own gowns. Albert was gone, but his hair, and her devotion to it, remained everywhere. This wasn't just personal pain, it became policy. Mourning became fashionable, then expected, then practically law. You didn't just grieve, you performed it. Mourning clothes, mourning stationery, mourning etiquette. And hair? That was the thread tying it all together. Queen Victoria owned multiple hair relics, some from Albert, some from her children, and even a few from her own younger self. She reportedly gave a lock of her hair to each of her children before her death as parting gifts. One of those locks is still preserved today in a royal archive, pale gray and gently curled, wrapped in tissue, and labeled in her own hand. And here's your quirky tidbit: she even kept hair from other royals. When King Leopold I of Belgium died, she wrote in her journal that she had clipped a lock from his head herself and placed it in her mourning album. That's right, personal hair scrapbooking at the highest level of government. Historians still argue whether Victoria's intense mourning was a psychological necessity, a performative burden, or a political maneuver. Some believe her grief allowed her to withdraw from duties she found unpleasant. Others say she genuinely couldn't recover from Albert's loss, and her rituals were all that kept her tethered. Whatever the reason, her habit shaped a generation. Middle and upper-class women emulated her in every way, from their mourning dresses to the display of hair work in their homes. What had once been a folk tradition, quiet, private, became part of public decorum. If you were a proper woman in mourning, there should be a hair jar on your mantel, and not just for spouses, for children, for friends, for lost parents, lost causes, even beloved household staff. Some families kept a communal hair wreath above the fireplace, a circle formed by strands from each member, with new pieces added over the years, until the family was gone and only the hair remained. It wasn't morbid, it was continuity, a reminder of presence in a world that kept tearing people away. You look at the jar again, the one next to Albert's portrait. You imagine it, once resting in Victoria's private room, a symbol of her loss, a constant companion. It would have sat beside his letters, his gloves, the inkstand he last touched. All these silent artifacts forming a throne of memory. And this isn't just a royal eccentricity. There's something achingly human about it, because every person who's lost someone knows this. Sometimes it's not the grand mementos that hold the most meaning. It's the smallest things: a cuff button, a scribbled note, a lock of hair that still smells faintly of the cologne they wore. Queen Victoria just had more jars. Even Albert's death mask was part of the display for a time, his frozen features immortalized in plaster beside the living reminder of his body, a curl of hair. And let's not pretend men weren't involved. Plenty of Victorian gentlemen carried hair keepsakes, especially during wartime. Soldiers kept locks from sweethearts tucked in pockets. Wives preserved the curls of husbands lost on foreign fields. In fact, entire regiments sometimes returned from battle with only a lock of a comrade's hair, delivered back to waiting families with a letter and a prayer. That's the reality. A century where death came early and often created a need for something permanent, something to hold on to. Hair was as close to immortal as most people got. And Queen Victoria's embrace of it didn't just influence fashion, it validated the sentiment behind it. If the monarch herself could carry a locket of her husband's hair every day for 40 years, then so could you. One anecdote: in 1890, a London woman asked to be buried with her hair jar clasped in her hands. Not jewelry, not scripture, just the coiled memory of her mother preserved in glass. You step back from the mantle. Victoria's mourning may have cast a shadow over an entire era, but within that shadow, thousands of tiny personal rituals took root. Women who mourned quietly, but with intention. Girls who clipped curls from a brush and whispered promises to the dead. Families who gathered each December to add new strands to the wreath and remember who was missing. And always the jars remained, clear, patient, full of silent feeling. Victoria may have made hair jars fashionable, but the rest of the world made them sacred. You turn from the royal mantle and walk toward a hallway, narrow, wallpapered in rose damask, lit by the flicker of gas lamps. There's a room at the end, door ajar, where a faint soapy scent lingers in the air. Inside, a wash basin, a brush on a lace doily, and, tucked behind the water pitcher, a glass jar containing hair so fine and light it's almost invisible in the gloom. And that's where things shift. Because while the Victorians treated hair as sentimental treasure, they also treated it as biological inconvenience. Which raises the question, how did people who saved hair so carefully also barely ever washed it? Welcome to the next strange layer of this obsession, the paradox of hair as heirloom, not hygiene. Mainstream fact: in the 19th century, most women only washed their hair once every 1 to 2 weeks. Daily shampooing was rare and often discouraged. Hair products were primitive at best, many based on lye, ammonia, or rainwater vinegar, and salons were mostly for the wealthy. Instead, hair was managed with brushing, dry powders, pomades, and creative styling. The emphasis wasn't on cleanliness, it was on presentation. Your hair didn't have to be fresh, it had to look composed. Braids, buns, and elaborate updos were common, not because they were fashionable, though they were, but because they hid the fact that your scalp hadn't seen soap in 11 days. Historians still argue whether this aversion to frequent washing was grounded in medical caution or just logistical exhaustion. Some physicians warned against too much water on the head, believing it might weaken the nerves or invite female disturbances, whatever those were supposed to be. And here's where things get particularly odd. Despite the scarcity of washing, hair was preserved with fanatical precision. You wouldn't clean your scalp, but you'd pluck a strand from your comb, label it, and store it under glass like a Victorian time capsule. It wasn't about purity, it was about permanence. Now for the quirky tidbit. Because clean hair was rare, preserved locks in hair jewelry were often washed after being cut. Not before. You'd wait until someone died, then clean their hair to remove years of styling residue before using it in art. Imagine someone scrubbing your head after you're already gone, just to get the beeswax out. Very considerate, very strange. You stare at the jar on the basin shelf again. It's unlabeled, just a tangle of silvery strands, possibly an older woman's, maybe saved from years of brushing. It's delicate but not designed. It wasn't meant for a wreath or jewelry, just saved. This was common. Women collected hair not only for sentiment, but for practical purposes. As mentioned earlier, they used it to stuff homemade hair rats, those rolled forms that added volume to hairstyles. Sometimes they even sold their shed hair to wig makers, who paid by weight. Entire industries ran on the quiet, unnoticed hair falling from middle-class heads across the country. And in a truly delicious irony, that hair, collected in secret and sold in silence, often found its way into mourning jewelry for someone else. That ring inscribed, "In loving memory," might be made with hair from a housemaid named Clara, who never met the deceased. Of course, this caused problems. As demand rose, unscrupulous suppliers mixed in animal hair or dyed foreign strands to match client descriptions. You might think you're wearing Aunt Margaret's tresses. Turns out it's half goat and a bit of someone from Warsaw. Still, no one wanted to let go of the idea that hair was precious, that even if it didn't sparkle, it meant more than diamonds. A single lock could outlast entire legacies. When estates were divided, some women requested hair keepsakes instead of jewels. Hair had intimacy, quiet longevity, the weight of memory without the noise of inheritance, battles. Even so, it wasn't always treated reverently. Hair also showed up in places that now feel a little weird, like scrapbooks, under glass paperweights, in snuff boxes, even hidden behind portraits. It was both sacred and decorative, displayed and yet secretive, a private memento paraded in plain sight, which brings us back to hygiene. In a society that rarely washed, hair became one of the cleanest emotional tools available. Even when it was physically oily, even when you could trace every curl with the scent of lavender pomade, it was the most unchanging part of a person's body. Teeth fell out, skin wrinkled, hair just kept growing, or sat there in the jar, unbothered by time. You move to a lower shelf and find a particularly odd piece, a child's toothbrush. Next to it, a tiny vial of what looks like oil, and beside that, a labelless jar with fine golden fuzz inside. Baby hair, almost weightless. Probably the first cut, that sacred moment when a toddler's downy curls are snipped and saved, like harvest from a living thing. Some mothers preserve this hair without ever styling or washing it, not because they didn't love the child, but because the act of keeping it mattered more than what state it was in. You weren't preserving cleanliness, you were preserving presence. The idea still lingers today. You might not have a glass jar on your shelf, but there's a good chance someone in your family kept your first haircut in an envelope. You might not understand why until you hold it, because even now, with our weekly shampoos and leave-in conditioners and multi-step scalp routines, there's something in us that still treats hair as identity. We still say she has his hair, or I'd know that hair anywhere. And when someone's gone, it's often the thing we miss most. How it felt, how it looked in sunlight, how they fussed with it in front of a mirror. So, yes, the Victorians didn't wash often, but they understood something about permanence that we tend to rush past. They saw in each strand a record of self, of love, of memory, not always fragrant, not always clean, but always worth saving. You lift the jar one last time and peer inside. No name, no story, just quiet strands resting together, faded, fragile, and still, somehow, alive. You step into a different room now, same flickering gaslight, same slow creak of the floorboards, but here things have taken a turn from sentimental to stylish. This space feels curated. There's a walnut curio cabinet against the wall, its shelves lined not with mourning wreaths or homespun braids, but jewelry, tiny glass-fronted boxes, velvet-lined trays, gilt-edged lockets and brooches, their delicate clasps winking in the light. And inside each one, nestled among curls of gold, brown, and raven-black hair, are whispers of the Victorian elite's other strange obsession, wearing the dead. Yes, tonight we're talking about hair jewelry, those dainty, intricate, often downright eerie pieces that combined craftsmanship with quiet grief. Because if you could save a loved one's hair and you could make it into art, why not turn it into something you could wear on your chest? Mainstream fact? From roughly the 1830s to the 1890s, hair jewelry was big business. Mourning rings, pendants, earrings, bracelets, all featured real human hair, often braided or shaped into intricate designs and protected behind glass or crystal. They were custom-made, expensive, and deeply personal, sometimes more so than wedding bands. And before you flinch, remember, in an age without photographs, DNA tests, or videos, hair was the most tangible way to keep someone with you. It was portable memory, intimacy turned accessory. One common piece was the mourning brooch, an oval setting with a woven hair panel inside, sometimes surrounded by pearls or tiny seed beads. If the person was very dear, the back might include a glass panel holding loose strands or even hair formed into a miniature bouquet. And if they were extremely dear, you might have their initials woven into the design in hair of a contrasting color. These pieces weren't hidden. They were proudly worn, displayed at funerals, passed around at parlor visits. Entire books were published offering designs and etiquette tips. And like most things in the Victorian world, there were rules. Light hair was typically framed in gold, dark hair in silver. Children's hair was often adorned with pearls. Men might carry a hair locket on a watch chain. Women might pin one to their bodice or tie it around their wrist with black ribbon. And not all of it was mourning wear. Hair jewelry could be a romantic token, too, often exchanged between engaged couples or dear friends. One common design was the lover's knot, where two different strands were braided together, sealed under glass, and worn over the heart. A 19th century version of I'm wearing your hoodie, but with a bit more scalp. Quirky tidbit: not all hair jewelry was made at home. You could send a lock of hair by post to professional hair artists who would return a finished piece. And if you didn't have your own hair handy, no problem. They also kept samples on hand. Some were honest about it, others not so much. Yes, hair fraud was real. There are confirmed cases of people receiving memorial jewelry containing the wrong hair, sometimes from animals. It's Victorian identity theft, but with curls. Historians still debate whether wearing someone's hair was a genuine comfort or simply a fashion-fueled coping mechanism. Some suggest it gave people control over loss. Others say it was performative grief, a way to broadcast sorrow with style. And let's not ignore the tension. There's something undeniably intimate about someone's hair. Wearing it means carrying part of their body into public. That brooch pinned over your heart isn't just art. It's physical, biological, maybe even a little haunting. But that was part of the appeal. Hair jewelry allowed grief to move with you. You didn't have to sit in a dark room surrounded by mementos. You could carry the memory of someone out into the world, into the market, the church pew, the ball. Some pieces even included hidden compartments, tiny drawers or spring-loaded panels behind the hair display, where a scrap of handwriting, a pressed flower, or a miniature portrait might be tucked away. A secret inside a secret. Because sometimes grief needed its own lock and key. And the artistry? Unreal. Victorian hair artists weren't just braiders, they were engineers of emotion. They used micro tools to loop hair into lace-like filigree, create delicate feather shapes, and even form entire landscapes. Yes, some mourning pendants included trees, urns, or weeping willows entirely crafted from human hair, all arranged with the precision of a jeweler and the patience of a nun. Some women learned these techniques themselves, others hired professionals. Still others passed jewelry down through generations, locks of hair moving from mother to daughter to granddaughter, each time becoming more precious, more layered with meaning. You lean closer to one of the velvet trays in the curio cabinet. A bracelet lies there, 6 narrow panels of tightly braided hair, framed in gold, clasped at the wrist with a tiny mourning portrait at its center. You imagine the woman who wore it, fingers brushing over it absent-mindedly during long church sermons or tearful dinner parties. Every touch a tiny echo of the person it memorialized. Of course, not everyone admired these pieces. There were critics, some religious, some just squeamish, who found hair jewelry macabre or unwholesome. Periodicals occasionally poked fun at the dead adorning the living. One 1878 editorial called Hair Wreaths Morbid Relics Best Confined to Attics and Melancholics. But that never stopped the market from thriving. Demand only slowed in the early 1900s when photography, embalming, and cremation changed how people preserved memory. Still, many of these pieces survive, some in museums, others in antique stores, and a few in family heirloom boxes nestled between dried corsages and expired passports. You lift a pendant now, oval, framed in jet, the hair inside shaped into a perfect double helix, a Victorian symbol of eternal life. You hold it up to the light. The strands are still strong, still shining, still waiting to be remembered. You descend a creaking staircase, careful not to knock your shoulder against the chipped balustrade. The air down here is heavier, cooler, somehow more still. You pass a stack of old ledgers, a velvet chair with a broken leg, and then a wooden cabinet. This one's different. No glass, no velvet. It smells faintly of oil and old wigs. You've arrived at the backroom business of Victorian hair culture, the part few talked about in letters or tea circles, salons, wig makers, and the shadowy economy of anonymous hair. Because here's the unsettling truth, not all the hair in those beloved jars, jewelry, or family wreaths came from someone you knew. Sometimes it came from someone you paid. Mainstream fact: Victorian England and much of Europe hosted an active trade in human hair, driven by growing demand for wigs, hair pieces, and, yes, mourning crafts. The most desirable locks were long, uncut, untreated, and preferably from the countryside, where poor nutrition and hard water hadn't yet ruined the strands. Cities like Paris and Vienna became international hubs for hair merchants. There were wholesale markets where one could purchase a kilo of human hair, sorted by color and texture, bundled like wool. Some salons even advertised that their hair came from healthy alpine girls or pious country maidens, as if virtue made it glossier. Hair was money. If you were a poor woman in rural France or Ireland, selling your hair might feed your family for weeks. A 16-inch braid could fetch enough for bread, soap, and shoes, which sounds noble until you realize how little the seller usually saw of the profits. Middlemen took their cuts, salon owners marked it up, and you were bald, shivering, and 5 shillings richer. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, hair fairs were annual events. Young girls lined up and let merchants assess the quality of their hair. Some were offered sugar and trinkets to sit still while their tresses were clipped. Others were tricked entirely, told they'd get ribbons or bonnets, only to lose a lifetime's growth with one careless snip. Historians still argue whether this was exploitation or a rare form of agency. Selling your hair was voluntary, sort of, but in a world where choices were scarce and hunger was real, voluntary becomes blurry, and once that hair was sold, it vanished into the system. It might end up on the head of a duchess, or woven into a mourning brooch for a childless widow, or stuffed into a gentleman's hairpiece before an important political meeting. No one asked whose hair it was. No one wanted to know. Which brings us to the salons. Victorian hair salons weren't just for cutting. They were manufacturing hubs. They assembled false hairpieces, mustaches, mourning jewelry, even entire wigs styled to match the client's fading daguerreotype. Many of these shops had back rooms like the one you're in now, lined with bins labeled by shade: ash blonde, chestnut, raven, salt and pepper, human inventory. One well-known salon in London boasted over 300 pounds of hair in storage at any given time. That's a lot of memory, a lot of someone else's scalp. You reach into a drawer. Inside, bundles of hair wrapped in paper. One marked Belgian, 1874. Another, widow's order, 3 braids, infant curl. No names, no faces, just the raw material of grief and vanity. Because let's be honest, hair wasn't just sentimental, it was fashionable. Mourning jewelry might be about love, but it was also about looks. Your brooch had to match your gown. Your hairpiece had to blend with your own. The illusion had to be seamless, and when your own hair failed, too short, too gray, too thin, someone else's came to the rescue. Some salons were discreet, others not so much. One Parisian wigmaker was famously caught reusing hair from hospital corpses, which, yes, went as badly as you'd imagine. The scandal was hushed, the shop closed, but it was never the only one. Even respectable families sometimes turned a blind eye. If Aunt Matilda's braid was too brittle for the brooch, well, perhaps something similar could be sourced. Sentiment and substitution danced dangerously close, but grief makes people generous with details and stingy with doubt. You pull open a narrow drawer labeled Red Child. Inside, 6 tiny coils, each no bigger than a thumbnail. Were they sold, donated, taken? You'll never know. And maybe that's the point. Victorian society prized control over appearances, over behavior, over emotion. But death was the great disruptor. It made people vulnerable, messy, needy, and in that storm of sorrow, the hair industry offered a kind of false order. You couldn't bring someone back, but you could hold something that looked like them, or at least something close enough. And if it wasn't theirs, well, who would know? Historians now examine these pieces, lockets, wreaths, framed hair portraits, with modern tools. DNA testing can sometimes confirm relatedness, but often the samples are too degraded, or mixed, or impossible to trace. All that remains is the craftsmanship, the devotion, the hope that someone meant well. Today, we still wear extensions, we still buy wigs, but we no longer pretend the hair belongs to a memory. We've separated the emotional from the aesthetic. In a way, the Victorians did the opposite. They merged the two, and maybe that's why their keepsakes, no matter how macabre, still catch the light just right. Because they believed fervently, sometimes desperately, that even a borrowed strand could hold meaning if you just braided it carefully enough. You close the cabinet. Back upstairs, the jars are still waiting. But down here, in the shadows, is the part of the story most people chose not to think about. Not everyone mourned with their own hands. Some just paid the right person and hoped the hair felt familiar enough. You slip back upstairs, footsteps soft now, like the walls themselves don't want to wake the jars. A new one sits on a narrow shelf beneath a window, and unlike the others, this one's oddly decorated. Not just the hair inside, though that's been looped and pinned into a tiny rosette, but the jar itself is painted. A sun, a moon, and around the base, tiny stars. This wasn't grief. This was belief. Tonight, you're drifting into the even weirder currents of the Victorian mind, where science and superstition wore the same hat, and jars of hair weren't just mementos, they were power objects. Because once you believe hair holds memory, and Victorians absolutely did, it's not a huge leap to imagine that hair might hold something more. Mainstream fact: Victorian pseudoscience was booming. From phrenology, reading personality from skull bumps, to mesmerism, think hypnosis with more arm flourishes. The 1800s were a gold mine of curious ideas. Among them, the belief that human hair could retain not just presence, but essence, emotions, memories, even spiritual residue. Some mediums claimed they could channel the dead more easily when holding a lock of their hair. Others believed that keeping someone's hair close would strengthen your psychic bond with them, living or departed. A few even warned against touching unfamiliar hair in case you accidentally invited a spiritual hitchhiker into your home. No, thank you. Quirky tidbit: one fringe journal from 1873 suggested that keeping hair in a closed vessel could preserve vital impressions, and that opening such a vessel too hastily could release a person's final thoughts, like a perfume bottle for memories, fragrant and maybe fatal. Some mourning lockets were designed with this very idea in mind. You weren't just carrying hair, you were carrying them. In fact, certain brooches and pendants had inscriptions like "Still with me" or "Memory Eternal," and some even had slots to write a final thought beside the lock of hair, just in case the two needed to communicate. Historians still argue whether this represents genuine spiritual belief or a metaphor stretched into performance. Were people truly convinced the hair spoke, or were they desperate enough that it didn't matter? And this, perhaps, is the gentlest line between odd and ordinary in the Victorian world. Because when you lose someone and really lose them, you'd rather believe in something, that their presence lingers, that their love imprinted somewhere. And if hair doesn't decay like flesh, then why not imagine it keeps some echo of who they were? You look at the jar again, the painted sun and stars. Maybe it belonged to someone who practiced spiritualism. Maybe it was just a craft project from a particularly dreamy 16-year-old. But the message is clear. This hair wasn't just saved, it was charged. There are diary entries tucked in attics and archives that mention hair being placed under pillows to invite dreams of the dead. Others describe women whispering to the jars before bedtime, not prayers, just updates. Charles, I went to the market today. Mother, the roses bloomed late this year. It's not unlike what we do now, talking to gravestones, rereading texts, playing voicemails, just to hear someone's voice again. Victorians just did it with something touchable. Even more curiously, some believed hair could offer protection. It wasn't just emotional, it was magical. A curl from a mother might guard a child. A husband's braid could be worn in battle. There were even tales of women tucking hair into the seams of coats or pillows to ward off illness. One widow reportedly had her late husband's hair ground into pigment and used in ink. She then wrote letters to him with it. "He is both the message and the means," she wrote. That's not mourning, that's metaphysics. And while most people didn't go that far, the idea lingered that a piece of someone, a real physical piece, might still be connected to their soul, that the part of them that didn't rot might still remember. You find a thin booklet tucked beside the jar. Its title reads, "On the Vibrational Qualities of Human Hair." It's handwritten. Pages and pages of swooping script outlining theories about emotional residues, imprinted grief, and sympathetic strands. Is it nonsense? Probably. Is it touching? Absolutely. You smile a little, because at its core, this pseudoscience was just the human desire to hold on, to not let a person vanish into silence, to believe that what they left behind, if treated carefully, lovingly, might still carry something of them. And let's be honest, modern science isn't entirely above this. We know hair carries data, diet, hormones, stress levels. You can analyze a strand and learn someone's habits, their health, their secrets. It's not quite vibrational memory, but it's not far off. We may not paint stars on our jars anymore, but we still believe our bodies contain stories. One final note. During the spiritualist craze of the 1860s, some seance circles reportedly required members to bring a lock of hair from a deceased loved one, not for proof, for connection. The hair was placed in a bowl at the center of the table so that when the spirits arrived, they'd know who had been invited. Imagine that. A table full of women holding hands in the candlelight, while a pile of hair whispered between them. Creepy? Sure, but also kind of beautiful. You glance once more at the jar. You don't need to believe in magic to understand it. You just need to know what it's like to miss someone and wish they weren't quite so far away. Maybe a strand is enough. The floorboards creak again as you move toward a narrow corridor. Here, the mood is brighter, oddly formal. On the wall hangs a framed sampler stitched with tiny flowers, and beneath it, a shelf lined with modest but elegant glass boxes. Each one contains a curl of hair, neatly arranged, tied with ribbon, and tagged. A name, a date, a relationship. You've entered the social side of Victorian hair culture, the world of hair gifting etiquette, where who you gave hair to and how you gave it could elevate a friendship or quietly destroy a romance. Mainstream fact: during the 19th century, exchanging hair was considered one of the most intimate yet widely accepted forms of personal gift-giving. A lock of hair could be a token of love, a sign of deep friendship, a farewell souvenir, or a subtle flirtation. But the rules? Oh, the rules were relentless. You couldn't just hand someone your hair like a calling card. There were rituals, protocols, moral frameworks. Etiquette books of the time cautioned young women never to give a lock of hair before an official engagement. To do so was to suggest availability, or worse, intent. Quirky tidbit: in 1859, a London newspaper reported a minor scandal where a young debutante gave a lock of her hair to a visiting Austrian diplomat after only 2 evenings of conversation. Her family insisted it was meant in friendship. The diplomat assumed otherwise. The girl was shipped off to stay with cousins in Yorkshire. The diplomat left unmarried, but with a very smug souvenir. Hair was emotional currency, but easily misread. A dark curl slipped into a letter meant devotion. A strand wrapped in tissue and left on a bureau might signal affection or rejection, depending on whether it was tied with black or white ribbon. A wrong-colored bow could lead to weeks of awkward silence. Think of it as the Victorian version of accidentally liking an ex's post at 2 o'clock a.m. Historians still argue whether this rigid etiquette truly empowered women or simply boxed them into another layer of symbolic obedience. Some see it as a method for coded communication, especially for women who had no other outlet for emotional expression. Others see it as just another trap, another way to be watched, judged, and misinterpreted. Because a girl might save a boy's hair in her diary, and that was sweet. But if he found out, scandal, possession, presumption. Unless, of course, he liked it, then it was charming. Victorian romance was one long repressed balancing act with absolutely no emojis to clarify tone. And it wasn't just romantic. Hair gifting among friends, particularly young women, was widespread and encouraged. A farewell before boarding school, send a curl, celebrating a birthday, here's a braid stitched into a pillow sachet. Mourning a friend who'd moved to India, take this twist of her hair and sew it into your corset lining just over your heart. No pressure. You pick up a little box from the shelf. Inside, a perfect auburn loop tied with a pale green ribbon. The label says, Helen to Mary, 1865. No surname, no backstory, but you can feel the closeness in that gift. A hair loop like this wasn't something you gave lightly. It meant, you matter to me, maybe more. In fact, women's friendships in the Victorian era were often more physically affectionate and emotionally expressive than what we'd expect today. Sharing hair became a common way to cement that bond. You might press it into a diary with petals. You might keep it under your pillow. You might wear it in a locket, even while married to someone else. Did husbands find that odd? Sometimes. But in a society where men were frequently absent, at war, at sea, at business, it was often the women in a woman's life who shaped her emotional world, and hair was the thread that connected them, sometimes literally. One woman's bracelet from 1872 includes 6 tiny braids, each from a different female friend, each one labeled in miniature script. Agnes, C., Harriet, Mama, me, Clara. A wearable community, a wristful of memory. Not all exchanges were so wholesome. In more dramatic circles, gifting hair could signal secrets, hidden romances, forbidden attachments, or acts of rebellion. There are letters written in code, with hair hidden inside double envelopes. There are brooches left in desk drawers, unsigned, unclaimed, waiting to be understood. One particularly juicy anecdote: a governess in Bath was dismissed after her employer discovered a hair locket she wore wasn't from her deceased mother, as she claimed, but from the family's oldest son, who was engaged to someone else. Turns out, love triangles are much harder to hide when you're literally wearing someone's follicle signature. And yet, hair wasn't always exchanged. Sometimes it was requested. A suitor might ask for a lock to carry into war. A sister might ask for a braid before a voyage. Saying no wasn't always an option. Refusal could be interpreted as rejection. But compliance? That might mean commitment. You pause now, looking at one box near the bottom. The hair inside is blonde and slightly frizzy. A small card reads, "Returned with thanks." Ouch. The Victorian version of "let's just be friends." These jars and boxes and ribbons, so delicate, so passive, held entire emotional sagas. Whole relationships began, burned, or quietly collapsed under the weight of a single curl, offered or withheld. And here's what no one tells you. People didn't always get it right. Sometimes you clipped too much. Sometimes you sent the wrong lock. Sometimes you gave your hair to someone who never wore it, never wrote back, never even remembered where it came from. But you gave it anyway, because that's what love of any kind was in the 1800s. Quiet, tangible, risky, a piece of yourself handed over in hope, tied up with ribbon and left to be misunderstood. You set the box down. The sampler on the wall reads in tiny stitched letters. Memory fades, hair does not. Maybe that's all anyone needed to know. There's a change in the air now. Less incense and velvet, more starch and polish. You follow the scent of beeswax and old furniture into what must have been a parlor or drawing room. A high-backed chair sits near the window. A tea tray rests on a side table. But what dominates the room is the enormous wreath hanging over the fireplace. At first glance, it's just a beautiful Victorian wall decoration, intricate, symmetrical, floral. Then you look closer. Every petal, every leaf, every tendril, it's all made of hair. You've arrived at the competitive world of Victorian hair artistry, where women didn't just collect hair, they showcased it, and not as a quiet private comfort. No, this was performance, prestige, the Pinterest board of your grief. Mainstream fact, by the mid to late 1800s, hair wreaths became not just common, but coveted. These weren't simple loops of memory. They were elaborate sculptural works, sometimes more than a foot wide, featuring dozens, even hundreds, of individual hair contributions. Entire family trees crafted in brown, blonde, and gray. And they weren't just for mourning. Some wreaths were made for weddings, anniversaries, even church exhibitions. A particularly ambitious woman might spend months or years assembling hers. Each curl had to be washed, sorted, boiled, shaped, looped, and stitched onto wire. Then those loops were arranged into flowers. Then those flowers were formed into vines. Then those vines into a perfect oval, a circle, or sometimes an infinity symbol. All inside a glass-fronted frame with embroidered labels. The result? A masterpiece of sentiment, dexterity, and soft-core one-upmanship. Because, yes, hair work got competitive. There were competitions at local fairs, judged exhibitions, magazines that featured the latest in domestic sentiment design. Victorian women would sometimes borrow strands from friends just to fill out a floral cluster. Your hue complements Aunt Jemima's so well. Would you contribute to her corner? Some wreaths came with hand-drawn diagrams mapping out which flower belonged to whom. This rose is Sister Margaret. These lilacs is Grandmother Eliza. It was equal parts genealogy and botanical pun. Quirky tidbit? One Yorkshire family displayed a hair wreath composed of 4 generations of women and their horses. That's right. Chestnut and black horsehair was braided in with the human strands. Apparently, affection wasn't limited to bipeds. Historians still argue whether these wreaths were more about memory or display. Were they tender family archives, or just the Victorian version of social media? Look how loved we are. We fill the whole frame. Some critics of the time certainly thought so. A satirical magazine in 1882 mocked the trend, describing a Mrs. Penelope Wrigley, whose morning display now includes an entire dining room chandelier fashioned from her late husband's mustache. We hope that one wasn't real. Still, the truth remains. Many of these wreaths were deeply personal. They were made by hand at home by women who wanted to do something with all the love and sometimes the sadness they had no words for. They couldn't vote. They couldn't speak in public forums, but they could stitch a daisy out of their mother's hair and hang it where visitors would have to look. You step closer to the wreath over the mantel. There's a tiny handwritten tag at the bottom. Begun 1858, finished 1879. 21 years. 21 years of collecting, curling, and arranging. 21 years of joy and loss and memory wrapped into petals. This wreath doesn't speak grief. It speaks commitment. Hair wasn't the only competitive outlet, of course. Women also prided themselves on making bracelets, rings, and complicated shadow boxes, scenes of birds, anchors, crosses, even mini family portraits. Some crafted entire villages from human hair, complete with trees and fences, all housed in glass domes like snow globes from your nightmares or your dreams, depending on how into scrapbooking you are. There were also salon challenges. These weren't beauty salons, but domestic circles, where women would gather and compare the fineness of their work. You might be praised for your braid's tightness, your wreath's symmetry, or the cleverness of your design. Oh, is that a forget-me-not, made from 2 shades of Cousin Clara's hair? Why, yes, yes it is. Even etiquette books began including sections on the tasteful arrangement of sentimental hair work. You were advised to match your design to the occasion. Mourning pieces, stick to willows, lilies, or urns. Celebration wreaths, opt for roses, laurels, or acorns. And for heaven's sake, never mix hair from multiple lovers in one piece. That was poor form, and possibly cursed. You take a seat in the parlor chair. It creaks under your weight. A teacup still rests on the table. Cold now. the spoon left at an angle. Whoever made this wreath, whoever spent 2 decades twining loss into loops, must have sat right here, carefully pressing curls, sipping tea, listening to the mantel clock tick as she arranged grief into geometry. It's easy to laugh at it all now, the excess, the earnestness, the hairiness, but you can't deny the skill, the patience, the quiet, steady labor of remembering someone one curl at a time, of turning sorrow into symmetry. You rise and touch the glass covering the wreath. It's cold, unyielding, but the hair inside still holds warmth somehow, still loops in soft arcs, still clings to the shape it was given. We live in a world where loss often feels chaotic, messy, unframed. The Victorians tried to frame it, to give it edges, to say, "Here is my love, here is my grief. I made it into something you can see." And perhaps envy. You step away, the wreath remains, and somewhere, in 100 other rooms just like this one, its sisters still hang, silent, proud, perfect. The room you step into now is smaller, less polished. No delicate wreaths, no tidy tags or sentimental notes, just shelves, and on those shelves, locks of hair wrapped in newspaper, stuffed in cloth pouches, or braided and bound with string. They're not labeled. They're not pretty. They're hidden, because not every curl was clipped in love. Some were stolen, some were smuggled, some were protected like buried treasure. Tonight, you've stumbled into the shadowy world of Victorian hair theft and the women who guarded their tresses like gold. Mainstream fact? In the 19th century, long, uncut hair wasn't just beautiful, it was valuable. It marked class, health, youth, femininity. The longer and thicker your hair, the more socially desirable you were. It was your currency in marriage markets, job interviews, and portraits. And where there's value, there's always a black market. Hair thieves were a real thing. They snuck scissors into crowded theaters and marketplaces, crept up behind girls walking alone. In some cases, they even cut braids off sleeping children. One London police report from 1877 describes a man caught with no fewer than 14 braids concealed in his coat, ranging in length from 8 inches to 2 feet. Quirky tidbit: some women actually wore hair cages, metal comb-like accessories woven into their hairstyles, to prevent thieves from snipping off locks too easily. Others tucked bells into their buns or booby-trapped their braids with pins. There was even a brief fashion for decoy curls, cheap false tendrils designed to be snatched in place of the real thing. Victorian street smarts. Historians still argue whether hair theft was as common as newspapers claimed or simply sensationalized by a culture already obsessed with appearance. But either way, the fear was real, and for good reason. Hair was used for more than just mourning jewelry and wigs. It also played a role in spells, superstitions, and the occasional blackmail scheme. One woman in Cornwall accused her rival of stealing her hair and burning it under the full moon, claiming it caused her to lose all prospects of marriage for 3 years. Coincidence? Maybe, but the matchmaker agreed. And then, of course, there were the women who refused to part with their hair at any price. Real-life Rapunzels. The newspapers loved them. They appeared in cabinet cards, posing in corseted modesty beside braids that reached the floor. One woman in Wales reportedly had to loop her braid around her waist 3 times just to walk through doors. Some of these women toured. Yes, toured. Hair shows became a strange subculture. Demonstrations of washing techniques, braiding contests, longest hair competitions. The reigning champions guarded their locks like family silver. Some even insured their hair through private brokers. You pick up one of the braided bundles on the shelf. It's rough, plainly tied, with uneven ends. A working woman's hair, maybe cut in haste, maybe taken. And this raises an uncomfortable point. Not all hair was given willingly. Salon workers, maids, and impoverished girls were sometimes forced to cut and sell their hair by employers or family. One account from 1881 describes an orphanage where the children's hair was routinely sold to fund upkeep. The girls were told it was a donation to their betterment. It paid for blankets and wigs. Even within families, hair could be controversial. Some mothers refused to let daughters cut their hair for fashion or convenience. A girl's hair is her dignity, one 1875 guide insisted. Others fought to preserve it only in death. There are letters where sisters bickered over who got which braid from a dead sibling's head. No one wanted to end up with the scraps. And sometimes women simply hid their hair. They snipped it off quietly after heartbreak, or illness, or defiance, wrapped it in handkerchiefs, stuffed it in boxes under floorboards. There are entire attics where forgotten strands still rest, curled, quiet, once too precious to part with and too painful to display. Because even outside theft, hair was power. Giving it meant something. Keeping it meant something else. And losing it by scissors or circumstance could mean the unraveling of identity. That's what made it both sacred and dangerous. One tale tells of a servant girl who cut off her braid after a scandal with her employer's son. She left it in his coat pocket, tied with twine, and disappeared before dawn. Her braid was never claimed. It stayed in that family's cedar chest for 3 generations. You look back at the shelf now. These unlabeled locks, some frayed, some glossy, are no less meaningful than the bejeweled wreaths upstairs. In fact, they might be more so. These were the curls no one dared to frame, the strands with stories too sharp to hang on a parlor wall. You imagine the woman who kept them. Maybe she was a maid who clipped a curl before running away. Maybe she was a sister who held on to the braid no one else wanted. Maybe she stole it. Maybe it was stolen from her. All we know now is that it was saved, and in that act, whether from love, fear, guilt, or defiance, it became part of the hairwork legacy, just as human, just as tender, maybe more honest, because not every memory is pretty, not every keepsake fits in a jar with ribbon, but sometimes even a hidden braid in the back of a cupboard can hum with the weight of being wanted. You push open the final door in the hallway. It leads, oddly, not to a parlor or bedroom or vanity room, but to something resembling a study. There's a writing desk by the window, books stacked on the floor, a magnifying glass left mid-glance atop a spread of old documents, and in the center of the room, a small case, museum-style, with a single jar of hair under glass. This one isn't arranged. It's not braided. Just a tight, clipped lock of dull brown, faded with time, brittle at the ends. The tag beside it reads, Sample 428, Miss Beatrice Lowe, deceased 1872, recovered in 2013. You've entered the realm of modern science, because the story of Victorian hairwork didn't end when the corsets were unlaced and the gaslights went out. No, it's still going. In laboratories, in museums, in DNA archives, and pathology labs. Tonight, you're standing at the curious intersection of sentiment and science, where preserved hair from the 1800s is helping today's researchers understand everything from Victorian diets to arsenic poisoning. Mainstream fact: hair is a biological time capsule. It contains chemical records of what a person ate, what medicines they took, what metals they were exposed to, and even, in some cases, what illnesses they suffered. And unlike most soft tissues, hair lasts. A century or two in a cool attic? No problem. That means that the very same hair preserved out of love, grief, or curiosity can now be analyzed under microscopes and mass spectrometers. It's memory turned into data. Historians and biochemists now study Victorian hair samples to uncover hidden truths about the 19th century. What did middle-class girls eat in 1850s London? What toxins were absorbed by mill workers in Manchester? What medications left traces in the bodies of cholera victims? The answers are curled inside those silent, sentimental jars. Quirky tidbit: one analysis of hair from a preserved mourning brooch revealed dangerous levels of mercury, likely due to the use of calomel, a popular but toxic Victorian medicine. The woman who wore that brooch probably had no idea she was literally carrying a chemical warning from the person she loved. In another study, researchers found signs of lead poisoning in children's hair samples, traced back to paint used in toys and sweet wrappers. Imagine finding out a child died not from fever or bad air, but from licking their candy too enthusiastically. History doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it crackles under the lens. And hair doesn't just tell scientists what happened. It tells them who. Some genealogists now use strands of Victorian hair to confirm family trees. In cases where burial remains are inaccessible or damaged, a lock of hair preserved in a locket or envelope can provide the mitochondrial DNA needed to trace maternal lines. That dusty jar in the drawer, it might solve a 150-year-old mystery. Historians still argue whether these scientific approaches disrespect the sentimental origins of hair work. Is it right to take something that was once worn close to the heart and reduce it to trace elements? Or does analysis give these keepsakes new meaning, another chapter in their long, strange afterlife? Some families, surprisingly, welcome it. One woman in Boston offered her great-great-grandmother's mourning wreath to a university lab after finding it in her attic. She wrote, "I don't know if it's creepy or comforting, but it feels like she's still telling us something." And maybe that's the point. Even the most ornate Victorian hairpieces, designed to preserve memory, are now helping preserve history itself. They've become more than just personal artifacts. They're social documents, medical records, art pieces, and sometimes accidental crime evidence. Yes, crime. In one case, a fragment of hair found inside a Victorian-era ring helped solve a 19th century poisoning mystery. The woman had long been thought to have died from illness, but high arsenic levels in her preserved hair told another story. Let's just say her husband's name came up again, rather awkwardly, in several footnotes. But not every story is tragic. Some hair samples show evidence of excellent nutrition, high levels of protein, healthy iron content. Others reveal curious travel histories, with shifting chemical markers that suggest time spent abroad. One woman's hair revealed she'd moved from the UK to India and back, long before official records confirmed it. Her family only found out because someone saved her hair, and someone else thought to look closer. You walk slowly around the display case. The jar inside is plain. No frills, no ribbon, just that one unassuming lock of hair. And yet it may hold more personal detail than any photograph, any diary, any letter ever could. That's the difference between memory and evidence. A letter tells you what someone wanted to say. A curl of hair, that tells you what they were. And let's not forget, this only works because Victorian women cared enough to keep hair in the first place. They stored it, labeled it, protected it. They passed it down. They turned it into heirlooms, sometimes out of grief, sometimes love, sometimes pure habit, but always with the belief that it meant something, even if they couldn't imagine how much. You return to the desk. There's a notebook open, filled with chemical symbols and cursive notes. The last line reads, "Nothing else of her survives, but the hair remembers." And maybe, in the end, that's the most haunting truth of all, that the part of you the world was most eager to cut off, pin up, and hide away, turned out to be the part that lasted. The room you step into last isn't a parlor or a study. It's not even a proper room. It's an attic. Low ceiling, dust-thick beams, the slant of light from a tiny round window casting everything in soft gold. You duck beneath hanging rafters and scan the clutter. Trunks, boxes, old chairs, a cradle no one remembers. It smells of cedar, dust, and linen that hasn't moved in 50 years. And there, tucked behind a stack of hymnals and an embroidered fire screen, you see it, a single glass jar. The label has long since faded. The ribbon around its neck is crumbling. Inside is a coil of golden hair, pressed gently into a spiral like a snail shell. It hasn't moved in a century, and yet it still shines faintly in the attic light. You're standing with the last lock. This is the end of the trail, the jar that was never passed down, never displayed, never even missed. It didn't make it to the mantel, or the vanity, or the mourning wreath. No brooch, no velvet shadow box, no portrait to pose beside. It was stored, and then forgotten, until now. And yet, it's still here, still whole, still human. Mainstream fact, countless Victorian hair relics are scattered in attics and antique shops today, misplaced, mislabeled, or mistaken for decorative oddities. Dealers sometimes toss them into curiosity bins. Auctioneers sell wreaths to decorators. Few realize they're handling literal remnants of the dead, or the adored, or both. Quirky tidbit: one woman in Maine bought a lidded sugar bowl at a thrift shop. Inside, a tiny velvet pouch containing 2 loops of braided hair and a love note from 1862. "I shall never unbraid us again," it read. She now keeps it beside her toothbrush. Historians still argue what to do with these forgotten pieces. Should they be archived, displayed in museums, returned to descendants, or simply left alone like fossils of a quieter, stranger kind of affection? It's a question with no easy answer, but standing here in this attic, the answer feels less important than the act of noticing. Because even without a name, this jar matters. Someone once loved the hair inside it. They cut it, tied it, sealed it in glass. Maybe they meant to give it away and never found the courage. Maybe they kept it close until the end, and no one knew what it meant. Maybe it was tucked into a drawer for safekeeping, then shuffled higher and higher in the house as time passed, until finally it became nothing more than weight. But it never stopped being real. That's what makes hair different from paper, from perfume bottles, from brittle gloves. It's alive even when it isn't. It remembers shape. It resists decay. And it asks you gently to wonder, who was this? What did they feel? Why was this worth saving? You crouch beside the jar and tilt it slightly. The spiral of hair shifts just a little, like it's exhaling. A breath that's been waiting 100 years. This moment, quiet, dusty, slightly strange, is the one that ties it all together. The jars in the parlors, the wreaths above fireplaces, the lockets worn over hearts, the secret drawers, the competitive salons, the psychic circles, the widow queens, it all leads here, to a forgotten attic and a jar full of light. You could take it, of course, display it, sell it, submit it to a lab, or tuck it back exactly where it was and let it keep dreaming, because some memories don't need to be studied or shared. Some are complete simply by surviving. As you rise, the sunlight hits the jar just right, and for a second, just a second, it seems to glow. You stay there for a moment, still and quiet, in the hush of the attic, listening to the soft tick of memory you can't quite name. Dust swirls in the air like pollen, like dandelion seeds, like time. Below you, the rest of the house seems to sigh. The portraits, the drawers, the glass jars and coiled wreaths, all resting in their places again. You can almost hear them settle, as though your visit stirred something that hadn't moved in decades, and now everything returns to stillness. The weight of it all, the sentiment, the artistry, the strange devotion, fades into something gentler, something that doesn't ask for explanation, just attention. The last lock, the last label, the last whisper of someone who once sat by lamplight, clipping and tying and preserving a piece of another soul, or maybe their own. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay if the names are lost, if the stories faded, if all that's left is a single curl behind glass, waiting for the right eyes to notice it. You've noticed, and that's enough. Let it rest now. Let it all rest. The combs, the ribbons, the griefs, the goodbyes. Let them dissolve into quiet as soft as fallen hair on a pillow. Close your eyes. You've walked through love and longing, sorrow and superstition, all bound in a single enduring strand. No more questions, no more footsteps, just sleep. You're safe, you're remembered, you're home.